what I'm going to talk about today is why. Why is growing the Indigenous business sector in Australia so important? We talk about it a lot, and we talk about what we want to achieve, but we actually don't talk about why that is important for you, for me, and for our communities. And by our communities, I don't just mean Indigenous communities, I mean Australia as a whole. There's a lot of economic benefit that results. For those of you who don't know what we do at AMC, this presentation is not a presentation about AMC. As I said, it's about the value of investing in Indigenous business. I'll just give you a quick boilerplate on who we are and what we do. We're a dating agency for business, essentially. So using that metaphor, we are hopeful that if we can connect the largest buyers in the country and the world, both government and corporate, with Indigenous small to medium-sized enterprise, we can connect those two and get those buyers to buy goods and services off Indigenous business. That's going to be one of the quickest ways to close the gap on Indigenous disadvantage, grow prosperity in Indigenous communities, and grow the Indigenous business sector. So we have an office, our headquarters is in Sydney, but we have just, we've had an office in Perth for the last 2 months. So we're in the West now, which is really exciting. Before I go into why it's important to invest in Indigenous business and its value, I just want to share with you some of the assumptions behind my presentation. And this really gives you an insight into the way that I think. I am not a deficits person. I always think about what we can do and what we can achieve. So there's nothing in this presentation that's going to talk about how little we've achieved or what Indigenous business can't do or how it's struggling. No, that is not what this presentation is about. This is about the strengths approach, and it's about what we can achieve, and there's a lot that we can achieve. This presentation is also a big picture view. I'm not going to go into the details of how individual buyers and companies can do work to work with Indigenous business to help grow them. I'm going to walk through a macroeconomic perspective on how we can position Indigenous businesses to create value for the broader economy. Also, what I'm going to be talking about is in a commercial context. So when I talk about Indigenous business, I'm talking about business, I'm talking about commercial entities, I'm not talking about the not-for-profit sector. And finally, I do want to say that I guess this is an extension of my strengths-based focus. I believe that Indigenous business can do anything. I believe that one day our sector, Indigenous business sector, will be a real economic player, and we'll go through the trends in its growth, and if those trends come to fruition over the next generation, our sector will be an economic powerhouse. And by that I mean Indigenous business and job creators, not just for Indigenous people, but for non-Indigenous people as well. And that Indigenous business is broad and deep. We often call ourselves at AMC, the team at AMC, mythbusters, because we often get confronted with a lot of myths about what Indigenous business can and can't do, what it is and isn't. The businesses that we work with supply everything from teleconferencing services through to building and construction, transport and logistics, stationery, office wares, you name it. Indigenous business does it. So there's just some of the insights into the assumptions that underlie my presentation so that you can get a sense of the perspective that I'm coming from. I've also got a national and global view. I know we're in WA and some of you folk are a bit parochial, but I do have a national and global focus, and that's deliberate because I think there are so many opportunities, especially for Indigenous business, as well as for a lot of the corporations in the room, that if we can use some of the models that are working nationally and globally, together we can take WA business further. And also, I think beyond the resources sector as well, so a lot of the industries that I'll be talking about are not related to the resources sector. So why do we care? We care about the value of Indigenous business, not just in Australia but also globally, for three main reasons. There's very clear economic benefits, there's very clear social benefits, and there's very clear cultural benefits for supporting the growth of Indigenous business, not just in Australia but in key markets like the US and Canada. And so what I'm going to do over the next couple of slides, I'm going to concentrate on the hard numbers, the economic benefits and the value that's created by minority businesses or First Nations businesses. I'm going to start off by talking about the United States and Canada and what has occurred there over the last couple of years. And the reason why I'm going to do that is to show you that it does actually work. It is possible. It's happening in other countries, and if we can take the learnings from how they've achieved that growth in those markets, then that's a pretty useful starting point for a formula for success here in Australia. And that's the model that ANCSI has been based on since our inception. So I'm going to talk about the economic benefits and the value created in the US and Canadian markets by First Nations businesses. I'm then going to talk about what's happening here in Australia from an economic point of view, and also touch on some of the social and cultural benefits that flow from growing Indigenous business. And then I'm going to wrap up with what we might achieve in a generation. So if we do see these trends playing out, what could the sector look like, very realistically, if we pull certain levers? So we'll start off with the US, and we'll start off with First Nations businesses. So the government terminology, just so that people don't think I'm being offensive, for First Nations is American Indian and Alaskan Native owned businesses, two Indigenous groups on the mainland of the United States. I haven't included Hawaii in this because their definition of Indigenous is American Indian and Alaskan Native. So if we look at these enterprises, we're seeing a few really exciting trends. It's about 230,000 American Indian and Alaskan Native owned companies in the US. And their total receipts gross receipts in 2007 was about $34 billion. That segment of the population has a buying power of about $65 billion per annum, and they employ about 137,000 people in their companies and pay out about $7 billion in salaries annually. So, pretty big economic player when you think about it. $7 billion in salaries annually, over 100,000 employees. On an aggregate level, the minority business sector in the US created about 5.1 million new jobs in 2011. So this is what I would think would be an economic powerhouse. So on economic terms, the First Nations business community in the US is contributing to the US economy very clearly. I'm going to now move on to the African American owned businesses, and while African American owned businesses are not First Nations, obviously, a lot of the disadvantage that is experienced in African American communities is similar to the disadvantage we experience here in Australia. But also, they don't have something that we don't have, which is they were never recompensed for being enslaved. They don't have the capital from land to build businesses from. Unlike First Nations in Canada and the US, who were given compensation for the land, we haven't been unless it's locked up in native title agreements. And African American community similarly doesn't have that capital base. So I thought it was useful to see what journey they've had without having a capital base to build from. So in terms of African American enterprises, about 1.9 million African American enterprises in the United States. That's as at last year. Their gross receipts were in the order of $135 billion. So that is the total receipts, that the pre-tax and pre-expenditure revenue for those businesses. They employ about 900,000 employees, and they're the fastest growing minority business segment in the country. Their growth rate by gross receipts is about 60%. Their growth rate in terms of numbers is about 50%. So they're outstripping non-minority business, they're outstripping the growth of other minority businesses. Let's just flip to Canada now. And I've just captured this economic story for Canadian Aboriginal enterprise. There's about 37,000 Aboriginal businesses in Canada, and they are growing at a rate of about 30% every 5 years. And their gross revenues were about $974 million in 2011. And 35% of Aboriginal business owners surveyed, 35% of them felt that their revenue had increased in that 5-year period between 2001 and 2006. So again, we're starting to paint a bit of a picture here that minority business can be a contributor to its local economy. And what are some of the trends here in the value generation? Where are they focusing their efforts? Where are they deriving this value from? And I just want to take a moment to explore how they are actually generating this value and why are they growing at such a fast rate. So they're focused, and this is a common trend across the US and Canada, is that minority businesses are focusing on knowledge-based industries, including technology and innovation. So that's a key focus for minority businesses. They're where the markets are, and so that means that they're predominantly located in urban areas. They are more likely to have global operations, so minority businesses from the US and Canada are doing business globally. They have higher rates of minority and Indigenous or First Nations employment compared to their non-minority counterparts, and they have a faster rate of growth. And some research was done in the US in terms of what is the multiplier effect of these businesses. So what return is there to their local economies if they are creating all of this revenue? And it was found that for every $100 that is made, $45 goes back into their local economies. In First Nations and minority businesses were more likely to do other business and do transactions in their local communities than large chain stores and big brands, which only put back about $15 for every $100 that they earn back into their local communities. So there is a very clear economic argument that supporting minority businesses or Indigenous businesses is supporting the broader economy. So what about Australia? What's going on here? Unfortunately, there's a dearth of data. I would love to be able to compare gross receipts, for example, for Australia and Canada and the US, but we just don't have that information. The best available information that we have is actually the data we have through AMPSI around the annual revenues of our 156 Indigenous businesses that we work with. But we know there's 8,900 Indigenous businesses as at the 2011 census, so giving you the annual receipts of 156 is not going to be representative. But what we do know is that of those 8,900 businesses that identified themselves as being businesses in the latest census, 340 employ 20 or more employees. And that's really exciting. What's really exciting about that is that there's actually a high proportion of those in WA. We did some postcode analysis on where they are, and New South Wales, Queensland and WA is where they're located, and predominantly around the mining industry. gross receipts from our 156 ANSI certified suppliers was for last year was in the order of 28 million, and that's 100% growth on the previous year. And what we've also seen from the census from 2011 is that 382 Indigenous business owner managers, they reported having salaries over $105,000 a year. So that's a pretty exciting story to tell as well, I think, because we'll track this trend over time, and what we'd like to see is as Indigenous business grow, the number and proportion of Indigenous owner managers who are reporting in a higher income bracket is also growing. And it's great to hear they're also paying themselves a salary. But how does Australia compare to the rest of the world then? What's interesting with this shows you the rate of growth of Indigenous businesses and African American businesses in US, Canada and Australia. So this bar is the growth rate, which is about 60% for African American businesses over a 5-year period. They're all over a 5-year period. First Nations is quite low at about 15%. Canadian First Nations is around just over 30%. And Australia First Nations is actually higher than the rest. It's about 35%, 35-40%. So in terms of growth of the business sector by numbers and on a proportional basis by gross receipts, we're actually doing pretty well. But the work is not done. If we think about what the drivers are for this growth in particular, the African American business growth, and you talk to any African American business owner in the United States about what are some of the key drivers for their growth, I bet they would say there's a few things. Government set-asides. So the federal government and state governments have set aside particular contracts for minority businesses. And in 2011, minority businesses received about $700 million worth of federal, state and local government contracts in that year alone. So that's a significant driver of growth. That's one thing that we're working with the federal government on at the moment, is looking at how we can build off the Indigenous Opportunities Policy and the exemption to the Commonwealth Procurement Guidelines to have set-aside contracts for Indigenous business. There's also a corporate focus. There's Fortune 500 companies in the United States that have committed to what's called supply diversity, so building minority suppliers into their supply chains. And there's about 17 of those Fortune 500s that form the $1 billion roundtable. And what that means is every year they spend over $1 billion with minority firms. So there's a very clear focus on doing business with minority business. What's also interesting, just from that growth, is that growth in the minority firms, especially African American firms, post-GFC and during the GFC, still outstripped the growth rates for non-minority firms as well. So so I've talked about the numbers and the economic benefit, but what about the social and cultural benefit? And it's very clear to me that when I work with the business owners that we work with through ANSI, is that there's a very clear social and cultural benefit. The businesses that we're working with, the entrepreneurs who lead those companies, they are pioneers and groundbreakers. They are showing that our people can do business differently, that we can succeed in the business world, and they're changing mindsets in doing that. And I think there's a really important role modelling effect there for the generations to come. We're also building off and seeing that we can actually seek out and seize opportunity. And to give you an example, we took a group of Indigenous businesses, about 22 Indigenous businesses, over to Denver, Colorado last month. And the purpose of that was to expose them to global markets and to find global business opportunities and partners to help seize those opportunities. And out of a total conference delegate group of about 7,000, we were about 30 of that 7,000, but everyone knew who the Aussies were. The Indigenous business owners there, they did us all really proud. They were cutting deals, not letting any opportunity pass them by, and they were really seeking out and living out their dream of taking their business global. And Gordon Cole and David Williams were part of that delegation, and they're here today, so you can talk more to them about that. So I just want to wrap up now with the future. What could we actually achieve in a generation in terms of the value that Indigenous business can generate? So if we work on the trend that we've seen over the last 3 censuses with the growth of Indigenous business, and we apply conservatively a 40% growth rate every 5 years over a generation, so over a 30-year period, we'll see Indigenous businesses being around 67,000 by 2041. If we apply the growth rate of African American owned businesses, which is 60% every 5 years, that will mean that by 2041 Indigenous businesses will be around the 150,000 mark. It's pretty astounding. When you think of those numbers, you then start to think about the economic impact and multiplier effect. So that could translate to, if we're conservative and we just focus on, in 2041 there's 67,000 Indigenous businesses operating in Australia. Conservatively, we estimate that that's about 2.2 billion in gross receipts annually. And that's about 740,000 employees across those businesses, and it's about $1 billion flowing back to the Australian economy and Indigenous communities through salaries, through business transactions and the like. So I think if we can leverage the $34 billion in annual government spend, if we can leverage policies like the Indigenous Opportunities Policy and the exemption to the Commonwealth Procurement Guidelines, if we can get set-asides in place and we can harness that goodwill that corporations are already showing to do more business with Indigenous business, we can really drive the growth of the Indigenous business sector and create more value, not just within Indigenous communities, but also for the Australian economy. Thank you.